Welcome, everybody, to the wonderful D Magazine. We don't like to call it an office. We like to call it a studio. The D Magazine Studios. Doesn't that sound cooler? Thank you very much for joining us. So the reason we're gathered tonight is because, I guess it was last week, TxDOT began a series of meetings about I-345, which you can see from our office windows, and what the future might hold for that highway. If it were torn down, and I think probably most of the people here are familiar with the several options that are before us. But there was a lot of information that wasn't provided at these meetings. What's the best guess as to what would happen if the highway were brought down to a boulevard, if the highway were brought below grade? These things have actually already been guessed at by some of the smartest people among us, and yet that information was not provided. And there was something else that wasn't provided, and that was adult beverages and snacks. Okay, and so we said we can do these meetings better. We can not only open up the conversation to a Q&A, which TxDOT unfortunately did not until at least Senator Royce West stumbled into the first meeting and then as a bull into a china shop and began taking questions that TxDOT wasn't prepared for. But not only can we open it up to Q&A, but we can open it up to adult beverages and cheese. This is what D Magazine is here to do. This is how our slogan, our guiding, our lodestar is make Dallas an even better place. And so tonight, that's what we're going to do. So, senior editor Peter Simic is going to moderate this panel, and my job is to introduce him. And I feel like I've already ID'd him, and so my job is done. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming to our humble home. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim, and thank you all for coming out tonight. And like Tim said, I mean, there's not only have there been the TxDOT meetings in the last week, but this is a conversation about the future of I-345, and with it, the future and shape of really the entirety of Dallas. We've been having here at D Magazine and in the city for at least 8 years or more. I think it might have been around when the first article framing this idea was printed. But before we started and taking it like that, not everybody in the city has been living and breathing this issue weekly, daily as we have. We wanted to put it in a little context before we start talking about it. And it may seem at first like a counterintuitive idea. There's an old highway, what do we do with it? Let's tear it down. But that conversation and that idea is happening within a broader national and international context, thinking and rethinking about how we shape our cities, how we undo some of the mistakes of the past, and how addressing highways in urban places is a big part of that project. And so we have a short video, I believe it's 5 or 6 minutes long, that talks about, in brief, I think offers a brief summary about some of the other places that are exploring these similar ideas, and I thought that might be a good way to kick it off. So if we can roll the film.
This is the view from my office window. It's Seattle's Alaskan Way Viaduct. A few months ago, this double-decker freeway carried 90,000 cars over the city's downtown waterfront every day. Now, it carries 0 cars because they're tearing it down and replacing it with a tunnel. But for 3 weeks, we got a glance into what it's like to go without a big downtown freeway. But could you do that forever? Just get rid of a freeway? To answer that, we're going to take a road trip through history. US freeway mania really kicked off during the 1950s when President Eisenhower created the Interstate highway system. But even he was shocked when he saw construction crews building the Capitol Beltway in DC.
Even he recognized how destructive freeways would be in cities.
Before long, people were using the freeways to drive everywhere. They were crowded, expensive, and bad for the environment. They cut through urban communities and fueled neighborhood segregation. And making them wider wasn't helping congestion. See, roads don't really follow the normal rules of the universe. Take this freeway. It has a traffic problem, and so the seemingly obvious solution would be to widen the road. But that original traffic was also acting as a kind of driving deterrent. New space would give people a reason to get back in their cars. This is a real phenomenon. It's called induced demand, a law of economics since 1962. So more lanes attract more drivers, and soon you wind up with the same traffic you started with, which brings us to our first stop in our Dead Freeway tour, Portland, Oregon. The freeway carried traffic along Portland's downtown riverfront, and the highway department had plans to expand it.
Some highway engineers have a mentality, engineeringly speaking, that would run an 8-lane freeway through the Taj Mahal.
That's Tom McCall. He was Oregon's Republican governor. He came up with a kind of crazy idea for the time. What if they tore down the freeway and replaced it with a park? And this was the nation's first big freeway removal. Oregon was building 2 interstates in the area, so this downtown freeway just wasn't that necessary anymore. And it didn't end up creating the traffic nightmare that some had predicted. It was basically the 1960s version of this.
Cars, man, why?
Next stop, San Francisco, the 90s. From the beginning, activists fought this freeway, which blocked off the city's iconic waterfront views. There was even this 1955 editorial in the San Francisco Chronicle that roasted Seattle's Viaduct as a warning against the proposed freeway. Ugly structure dominates architectural features in its vicinity. Yeah, that's fair. The thing that finally sealed the freeway's fate was the big 1989 earthquake. It damaged the Embarcadero and several other freeways in the area. Suddenly, San Francisco was faced with a choice. If you want to keep the freeway, you'll have to pay to fix it. And that did the trick. In 1991, the Embarcadero Freeway came down. In its place, a surface boulevard with big walkable sidewalks. The traffic impacts were pretty minimal. City streets absorbed some traffic, and without the freeway, some traffic just disappeared. The area around the Embarcadero became a waterfront destination. It saw higher property values, more economic activity, and more jobs. Some say the freeway removal added to the Bay Area's rapid gentrification. And while that area was expensive to start, housing prices did go up. For other places, there's a real lesson there. How to remove a freeway and make sure the people who live there can stick around for the benefit. And so here we are, Seattle 2019. Here's a little background. A 2001 earthquake damaged the viaduct. 18 years later, the city's tearing it down and replacing it with a tunnel, but not before the final challenge. Before the new tunnel could open, they had to close the old viaduct for 3 weeks. It was officially called the period of maximum constraint. Also,
Viaduct, Carmageddon, there was a few other ones that I probably shouldn't mention.
so best case, people change their habits. Everyone who doesn't have to drive, doesn't drive. Worst case,
Unreasonable congestion that nobody would tolerate. It'd take hours to get into downtown.
so what happened? For the most part, people found other ways to get around.
We had about a 10% decrease in vehicles coming into downtown.
Here's a typical bike count in Seattle during this time of year. And here's what happened during the viaduct closure.
I never would have predicted it because January is generally not just cold, but rainy.
Transit ridership spiked too. And the light rail and commuter trains added more than 15,000 new riders. And finally, some of the trips just didn't happen.
And everybody goes, well, what happened to the trips? Well, it's not a finite amount of trips. People have brains and people make choices.
And then the tunnel opened, and things started to go back to normal. But those 3 weeks gave us a small window into how a city might respond to losing a freeway. Now, could Seattle have kept this up? It's hard to say, but history suggests that cities can lose a little freeway and not lose their minds. Thanks for watching. There's a lot of history out there that we didn't get to cover. We're going to leave some links in the description below if you want to learn more.
All right, well, let me introduce our panelists tonight. We have to my left Miguel Solis, who is a Dallas ISD board member, as well as the executive director of the Coalition for New Dallas. We have Amber Sims, who is a resident who lives near I-345, is part of that, very active in that neighborhood, and also works with an organization, Imagining Freedom Institute, which deals with issues of equity through a historical lens in an attempt to create change. And at the far end is who many consider the originator of this idea, the man who used to walk around Dallas without a car and walked around I-345 so many times he thought, let's get rid of this thing. Urban planner Patrick Kennedy, who is also a co-founder of the coalition and is a DART board member. To start, I wanted to ask Miguel, who had the unfortunate job of going to almost every TxDOT meeting and hearing their presentation, and how much of the information that we just saw in that video was presented by TxDOT during the meetings last week.
Well, thank you to D Magazine for allowing me the opportunity to be here. Thank you, Peter, for your moderation. I see my good friend, Councilmember Chad West, who's in the crowd tonight. And I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge you, and my good friend Dale Petrosky, and the two co-chairs of the organization that I'm honored to be able to work for now, the Coalition for New Dallas, Wick Allison and Lynn McBee, and our advisory board member, Mike Avalon, who's in the back. So I'm honored to be here. And I did have the opportunity to go to many of the TxDOT meetings. I saw a lot of you that were there as well here tonight. I love community meetings. I think I've grown to love them because I've had to have them as a school board official. And one of the things that I've learned along the way is that there are many types of community meetings. There are those that you can tell were planned with the intent, purpose of gaining true community input. There are those that are required by law that are enacted and still generate some good input. And then there are those that you can very clearly tell were a part of a check-the-box process so that you can keep the process moving forward. I'll allow you to have your own opinion and keep that, but I'll share my opinion. And that opinion is that for a decision that is so instrumental to the destiny of this city moving forward, and a monumental decision that I think many of us should have the opportunity to add our input into, it was an extreme disappointment. And I'm absolutely fine saying that in public. One of the reasons why was because there were people that went to these meetings with the absolute intention of gaining a better understanding of the possibilities of what could happen to 345. Many already exist, these plans. There were most people, I think, that left not having any indication as to the dynamics of the plans, the different scenarios, with more questions that I think ultimately are going to could have a detrimental impact to what ultimately happens for the rest of the TxDOT planning process. There were three major questions that I heard pretty frequently, and none of these questions, we didn't really have the opportunity to ask them. Question number one, very simple question that I'm sure we all have. What happens to the traffic if the freeway comes down? Question number two, what happens to the land underneath the freeway if the freeway comes down? Basic things like, who owns the land? And question number three, what's going to happen to the people who live in very close proximity to the highway as it relates to their ability to get to their jobs, wherever those jobs may be? I don't believe anyone left these meetings with an understanding of the answer to those three questions, and it's unfortunate because we already have a sense as to what those answers may be because of a dynamic process TxDOT went through in 2014 called the City Map process, the Dallas City Center Master Assessment process, which laid out a host of scenarios with the economic outcomes of each of those scenarios, with traffic studies of where traffic would ultimately disperse through. So, what is TxDOT going to do moving forward? TxDOT's intention moving forward, as it was stated to us, was all of the community input that they gathered in that community meeting, which was, I'm not quite sure, because no questions were asked or answered, they're going to take that and then go to step number two, which is to design potential alternatives, including the city map alternatives, so that way they can then present that to the community and get some tweaks, move forward with the ultimate future of the highway, which has to be determined because the life of the highway ends in 2035. That was my initial take, and I'll stop there at the moment.
Well, hopefully this panel will answer a lot of those questions that used to are raised at the TxDOT meetings. One of the things I noticed in the presentation that struck me was the history component of that presentation, which basically read, in once upon a time we built the highway, now we're going to figure out what to do with it next, which to me completely overlooks a vast and important history around how these highways actually impact the places they're put in. And Amber, could you talk a little bit about that history and kind of put the road in context to what it meant for Dallas when it was built and what it has meant through the decades?
Yes. Can y'all hear me? Okay, cool. Greetings, evening salutations to everyone. I think it's very important to talk about the history. Dallas is a city that doesn't like to do that, so if that makes you uncomfortable, we can have a therapy session about that later, because we're going to in these next few minutes, right?
That's why I heard the beer and cheese.
Yes, beer and cheese to get y'all all warmed up. To think about, the freeway wasn't completed until the 1970s, but the idea, right, when Eisenhower was president, and when the inception of the idea of let's create these freeways, and more specifically let's do this in Dallas, started in the 1950s. And we think about the civil rights movement, which was happening in the 60s, but what we don't talk a lot about is what was happening before that, in the 1950s. And what was happening was the bombing of black homes in the Fair Park area in the 1950s. What was also happening was the creation of, Dallas, which is gonna be right when people are let's get the city involved, why people are kind of I don't know about that, not sure it's a good idea. It's because literally the city of Dallas was taking land from black families in the Luffield area and saying, hey, thanks for being here, but this is now ours. And with those two things that were happening, what you find is that there was not a place for a lot of black people in the city to live in a way that was comfortable, in a way that was safe, in a way that even afforded them basic necessities like having a restroom, right? Like having access to schools. And also by the time that we get to the 1950s, what we see is that Dallas literally is okay, y'all, we have a major problem. We're gonna have to create something for black people to live. Actually somewhere, right? I think there's a movie about the creation of this idyllic little town. Well, guess what, friends? They did it in Dallas, Texas. And it's called, does anyone know? What's a neighborhood created in the 1950s in Dallas? Okay. Hamilton Park. It was created in 1953. And the plans for this freeway I-45, I-345 was also 1952-53. And so I say all of that to say is unless we really interrogate what was happening in this place at that time, that was not only just happening by happenstance, but it was happening by design. It was happening with a lot of intentionality. It was happening because people wanted it to happen. And it happened because people had power and some people didn't. And what we also saw is not far from where I live, I can literally walk to the church that Sidney Pittman built that now houses a nonprofit called Interrupt. And I'm right under the 345 freeway, which Tim told me is this way and not this way when I was pointing. So he's been rather helpful to me just tonight. Thank you. But what we see, right, is that there was an intentional design to separate Deep Ellum, which was once a burgeoning and prosperous black community, from the rest of downtown. And again, this was done intentionally. Right, and so when we have all of that, I think we can go forward, we can move on, we can have a conversation, and we can interrogate. Right? And I think a lot of you are probably whew, I got questions. Me too, y'all. But those are the things that we have to acknowledge to get to the next point.
Yeah, and 8th Street and St. Thomas.
Yes, child. My church is Pilgrim Rest Missionary Baptist Church, where the Reverend C.W. Wallace is my pastor at North Washington and Hall. And all of that, right? Short North Dallas is also historic and was also involved in this. And these communities were diminished as a result.
Well, Patrick, you also walked underneath I-345, and
Since I moved here.
and saw the way in which it was dividing the city, and had this idea of dealing with it in some way. And there's been a lot of work to date. I think one of the things that gets overlooked with the TxDOT process when you see their timeline is you see, city map, but there's no context for what that is and how it came about. And I was wondering if you could kind of walk us through how this has gone from initial idea to even the point where TxDOT's willing to talk about it, because when it originally came up, as I remember, they said, well, this is an old road, we need to fix it. And that back then would have been just the normal process of dealing with road maintenance. So how did this evolve, and take us through some of the work that's been done already?
A bridge version since I moved here in 2002. Work and saw nothing but boarded up buildings, vacant land, service parking lots. Was like, this should be the most valuable land in the city. Why is it like this? And that started my personal investigation into the relationship between transportation and land use and real estate values, and how development comes about. At the same time, Seoul, San Francisco, these other cities were removing highways and seeing benefits from doing so. And then coming around to the first Downtown 360 plan in 2008 or 2009, and there was a line in that document that said the downtown loop is a problem, but there's nothing we can do about it. And when I hear nothing we can do about it, that's when light bulbs go off, alarm sounds go off in my head and say, why not? Let's actually try to fix what's wrong. And so then a developer friend of mine named Brandon Hancock, we sat around having beers saying, that's messed up. We should actually be able to do something about this. Looked at every single highway around downtown, said, what are we gonna do? Clyde Warren Park was under construction. TxDOT had plans for 35. At the time, they had plans for 30. Nobody was talking about 345 at all. Doing some drilling upstairs, adding some loft units, maybe some affordable housing upstairs. Such a champion way. And we said, what if we just did our own plan? And said, what if we removed a section of highway at 345 because we know it's about 40 years old at the time, it's going to have to be replaced. What if we thought completely differently about it? And the intention wasn't necessarily like we're ever going to be successful. It was, what if we put this out there just so we could have this kind of conversation, so the city of Dallas can come together and publicly say, what is best for the city of Dallas in 2040, 2050, 2060, points beyond, right? Because in my estimation, the highways are not part of the 21st century, they're part of the 20th century, and a mistaken part of the 20th century if you actually study Eisenhower saying it was a mistake because his model was the Autobahn and Germans didn't bring it to the center of cities. And so then we met Commissioner Vandergriff, who's in the audience here, and we have to give him acknowledgement because we met with him in the rain under that highway for 2 hours, had lunch with him, and he was like, what are you talking about? Saying we're going to remove this highway, because this is the same time TxDOT was saying in 2014 saying, here's 9 different ways to spend money to rebuild the thing or repair the thing. We said, what about removal? Like, well, that'd be $2 billion worth. And we're like, no, not about a tunnel. We're talking about removal. And so Commissioner Vandergriff agreed with us when we said, hey, you actually need public input up front in the process, not at the end of the process to check that box. We also need to be thinking about what is the impact of these taxpayer dollars in transportation that it has on private value adjacent, or on quality of life adjacent, or on just the overall city economy. And he's like, you know what, you're right. So he kicked off this city map process. And how many people are familiar with city map? Hands up. Half-ish. How many of you read it?
There's an extremely brief synopsis at each of your seats to give you a little more information.
Well, ended up looking at, he hired a team of consultants, which included urban planners, traffic engineers, all the above. And they looked at all the various highways around downtown saying, you know what, we need a more comprehensive, thoughtful approach to how we invest our transportation dollars. And in 345, they looked at 3 scenarios that said, okay, what if we just removed a couple of the ramps, the modified version? What if we put it below grade, like 75 north? And what if we removed it entirely and went with surface street option? They went with surface street, just a sort of a boulevard. We'll get to that. And the result of that, of course, was that, hey, the traffic movement was actually minimal between the various options. I mean, frankly, when you look at their long-range models, everything fails everywhere. So, okay, maybe it's time for a rethink of how we do transportation entirely. But, of course, the removal option also had the most economic development potential, and so that's where it's like, okay, now let's start to take this a little bit seriously. Fast forward from 2016, from when this was an adopted document from TxDOT, to today, 2019, this thing was still sitting on a shelf. And that's, well, I think it's a problem, because it also said, hey, let's do I-30 now, 345 can wait until 2040 when this latest repair is met its useful lifespan, and we're going to have to replace it entirely anyway because there's no more Band-Aids for it. So the question is, well, why even wait until 2040 if, one, this land is so potentially valuable, but also that land is so potentially valuable, which means we can actually leverage it as a publicly owned land and take it from a liability to a public good and say, okay, what is that public good? Well, what do we need most? To me, I think we need workforce, mixed income housing, and we need lots of it. And we need lots of it where it belongs, which is near jobs and near transit. And that's downtown. That's the east end of downtown, right in between Baylor, right in between downtown and Baylor, right on the east end transfer center, right where D2 is going to be running underneath as well. Potentially great location for a lot of people to live. And so Coalition for a New Dallas has said, okay, what if we turn this into an economic development plan, tied it to I-30, and said, why don't we design these all at the same time, think about them in a coordinated, holistic way, and advance what we think are the two preferred options from the various elected and public officials that we talk to, which are the below-grade trench and the surface network option. But we had some issues with CityMap. We think it can be improved upon because it's very conceptual. The cost numbers, the economic benefit numbers, they're very broad, they're very sort of hazy. We wanted to put harder numbers to that. We also wanted to put better design to that. And in their economic development scenarios, it also shifts heavily towards commercial real estate, which half the office buildings in downtown are empty. We actually think the need is housing, and that housing growth will actually drive the demand to fill up the rest of that office. So Coalition for New Dallas has organize this new plan that we're working on to basically CityMap 2.0 and take these two options to the next level. And that's these next couple slides. Do we want to get into it now, or do we want to wait a little bit?
Let's circle back in a second. Miguel, did you want to add something?
Well, I just want to, so literally just within the past 10 minutes, we have been provided more information about how these plans, why these plans were necessary, how they manifest, what particular scenarios generate from an economic output standpoint, from a traffic dispersal standpoint, then what happened in any of these meetings that I attended over the course of 3 days. And the most important piece to this is that the people that I'm the most passionate about in this process, those who are going to be directly impacted by it because they live in the hyper-local environment around the highway, they had questions that could be answered. And if we're going to be sincere as a state and as a city about planning the future of this city, we need to keep the process of CityMap going. It was a revolutionary, visionary document that has these answers and that can be built upon. I don't know where we're headed, because if you look at where TxDOT is going to go next, it's now on to other alternatives on top of what CityMap presents, and then the next step and the next step, which is an 18 to 24 month process before ultimately decisions are made, and then you go with the construction.
Yeah, and you touch upon something that is, for anyone who follows transportation planning, which is a grueling task to ask of anybody, is the planning process itself almost has a mind of its own. And in dealing with agencies that do this kind of work, there's always the issue of how long range it is, how complicated it is from an engineering standpoint, how difficult it is to find funding and to fund them. And so it's hard to rope in real community, I shouldn't say it's hard, it's often real community engagement is what's left wanting. at this point in the process around 345, hearing that TxDOT has its plans, the city of Dallas has adopted city map, and TxDOT has city map as part of their plans. There's separate planning going on in other interested groups. What do you see as the right path for beginning that process of community engagement and educating and bringing people into the process so that the planning now can dictate a future that doesn't leave people aside?
Well, in many ways, I think this is where organizations like the Coalition for New Dallas has to come into play, simply because the culture of planning is so archaic that it can be very difficult unless you shock the system. And so, again, kudos to the shocking of that system, which happened both from organizations and TxDOT itself under the leadership of Victor Vandegrift. But I would say moving forward, the city should be at the table guiding this conversation, I think, as much as TxDOT is. And one of the unfortunate things is, even in conversations that I've had with a lot of my colleagues on the city council, they themselves have questions about what is city map. Elected officials were provided an opportunity at these meetings to talk about their thoughts on 345 and what it means for the future. And there were certain people in the room that had the opportunity to say something but didn't, because they quite honestly just don't know what that process is. So it's going to take city leadership, I think, to say, let's either reaffirm the stance that we took when we adopted the alternatives, the plan, under the last administration. So that's step number one. I think step number two is, let's keep the conversation going with the community, intentionally seeking their input that we then can submit to TxDOT on a rolling basis. But let's keep informing the public. Let's have our own community meetings. Let's work with organizations that have been doing this work and leading these efforts, because unless the city steps in to fill the void, I don't know if it's going to be filled outside of, again, the traditional approach to estate planning, the destiny of cities through their highway structures.
Amber, you spoke about the history of these kinds of projects and how the communities that are impacted them often have little reason to trust the planning process or trust public officials. What would have to happen in the context of moving forward with an idea like this to begin to try to rebuild or reestablish the kind of public trust needed for a project of this scale?
I think it can start on a number of levels. I think the first is, I start with schools, really teaching our kids about why freeways were created. I don't know about y'all, but that was not in my textbooks. So starting students as young organizers, right, and that is a group that we need to continue to have in the room. Was really excited to talk to a high school student who's here, but we need more of that, right? Like, how do we engage our students into this process so that they know what's going on? Because, like, the plans right now are saying this is going to be done in 20, 24 years. If that's the case, like, y'all, it's not just about the people in this room, right? It's about the people who are in schools, right? Dallas ISD has a great, design city, so Miguel can help us with that. But how do we get them engaged in that conversation, right? I think the second thing is, for a good reason, there are folks in this city who do not trust the city of Dallas because what has happened. And so there does need to be some truth telling. Right, and that is something that government agencies have struggled with, and yet it means a lot for communities to hear. There was harm done, and these are the things that we want to do to repair it, right? And I think that needs to happen, right? And it's a lot of different places. It's Fair Park, it's the Love Field area. It is what has happened in Little Mexico. Like, there are a lot of different conversations, but speaking specifically about I-345 is, like, people have to feel that there's something in it for them, right? And so when I was at the meeting in South Dallas at St. Philip's, folks were talking about very basic things in terms of, I need to get to Baylor. Because where I live, there is no hospital that if I needed urgent care that I could get to. And that is real, right? Like, I live right next to Baylor, so the freeway being torn down doesn't affect me in that way. But as an ally, right, and as someone who is in proximity to the community, that has to be my concern too, right? And so we have to begin to say, like, I hear you, I wrote down your questions. I take my notebook with me everywhere, and I wrote down the questions from people from that community specifically. And then what is we, like, are people with, like, we're saying, like, this is the solution? How do I get the solutions to the things that you need so that your basic needs are met? So that this is a solution for you too. And some things that have happened, like, I thought that this was cool with the I-30 thing. I couldn't find the article again, but there was something that was talking about guiding agreements because I-30 had gotten out of control from TxDOT, right? And the city of Dallas actually was like, actually, we're not gonna do that. Like, we wanna push back. And it worked, right? And I think Patrick can give you more, like, information, but there was something that when they decided that they weren't going to do it this way, they created guiding agreements. Those agreements were great. They were like, it will be no more than this many lanes, right? We will create boulevards, et cetera, et cetera. But those guiding agreements did not include people. So if we are going to talk about design, we need to talk about human-centered design. We need to talk about the people that are going to be most impacted on both ends, from the south to where it ends, right? And what are the agreements that need to be in place to protect those people, their assets, their property, and their futures? And I guarantee you that if people see, hear, and feel that, they will come along. But we have to be very realistic, right? There are people that don't even see this as a possibility because their basic needs are not being met. And we can help with that, right? There are some people in this room that can help with that, but first we have to acknowledge it.
Yeah, you touch upon one of the aspects of planning a project like this that makes it politically very complicated, and that is because there's a long-term 20 years, 30 years benefit that requires or suggests change in the near term that many people experience as being detrimental. And I think the most common question that you touched upon with the Baylor example is, how will I get around once I don't have this thing I've been relying on even for so long? Even if it's a thing that you waste hours of your day and you swear and it's how I get to school, work, etc. It's the old, where does the traffic go? And Patrick, in the simplest, sort of straightforward way possible. Because I think that's still, it's funny how we've been talking about this for years. People come to it new, and every time it's, where do I drive? And how do you begin, I guess not just simply saying, where's the traffic go, but how do you begin to change the perception around how you move around the city that can put people at ease and say, don't worry, you'll still be able to get to where you need to get.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is that facility fails for 6 hours a day when we need it most, just because it can't scale with demand, and that's the fundamental problem with highways, unless we want to keep widening them forever. And that's when you either have congestion or you have failed economies, and that's what happens in Detroit. And we've had many conversations with Baylor too, and they talk to their ambulance drivers, and their ambulance drivers say, we're stuck on this highway, we see your tower, we don't know how to get to you. And that's the fundamental nature of limited access highways, because they sort of suck up all the traffic, which means the surface streets are usually empty, barren, which means those fail as well from what they're supposed to be doing, which is generating economic activity. And the nature of the limited access highways, then there's only certain places to get on and get off, and that creates a fundamental problem. And I just want to add on to something that Miguel talked about too, about this process that's going on. And the process that the coalition is leading is intended to be a parallel process to the 2-year feasibility study that TxDOT is doing, because TxDOT's going to come out with a preferred plan, and we want to have some say in what that preferred plan is. So we're doing those two options to put a deeper dive into it so we can build the political support behind one of those to say, we think this should be the preferred option. And that's why they brought in Tool Design Group, who are the best in the country at looking at highway removals and highway mitigation strategies, which I can get into if we like.
Sure, go ahead, because I think a lot of the work that, and to clarify, the coalition is working with Tool Design Group to think through in more detail some of these questions of where do the cars go.
Yeah, Tool Design Group, based all over. In fact, these 5 people is a team full of traffic engineers, civil engineers, architects, planners, landscape architects, and they've been in town 2 or 3 times for week-long workshops where they've met with a series of stakeholders, but also studying city map to build off all the public work that's been done there. And we don't need to go through all the sort of the generalized feedback they got. We went through it with City Map. People want benefits out of whatever's going to happen out of this. They want a better city, whatever that ends up meaning, whether it's housing, whether it's better transportation networks, whether it's new parks, whatever it may be. And they went through sort of examples of the two scenarios that we're looking at, which is below grade trench, which we'd call a mitigated highway, versus the various removals that have happened. This is just 3 of the many that have happened. In fact, the U.S. Senate has just passed a couple $100 million in their new transportation plan to study highway removals from city centers. So it's a thing that's gaining momentum because every single removal has improved the area that it's been done. And part of the reason for this, as I mentioned, is that highways fail when we need them most because they can't scale with demand like, say, transit can, where you just drop another train in to the existing tracks. So when you plug in, say if I want to get to Pleasant Grove to the medical center, I want to get to Pleasant Grove to North Park Mall during rush hour, it says use the city streets because the city streets are actually faster right now. And what I'm saying too is that the limited access highway, by severing city street networks, actually harms the local city streets as well. So we actually worked with something where a much more interconnected city street network, there's many more options, there's much more capacity. Famously, Vancouver never allowed highways into their city. They were planned, but they rejected all of them, and turns out they actually have more street capacity in the network than they would if they actually would have built all those highways. And so building off the City Map study, which is in this document, they looked at the data, say, if you're coming up this highway, where are you actually going? So coming up 45, there's about 38% of the traffic is actually going up 75. So we wanted to build off that. A quarter of it is going to downtown, other it's branching off in various different ways. And so we wanted to say, okay, let's look at this in a more fine-grained level. Say, okay, and look at the latest traffic counts from TxDOT. It's 154,000 in I-45. It gets up to 180,000 in the latest counts in the middle of 345. But we also need to parse that. How much of that are in this in the network? And I can't even see what I'm looking at. But if we say, okay, what if we start with that 154,000 that's coming up from I-45, right, where that choke point is between 175 and 45, where they come together and hit 30. Well, if we're taking 38% of that is just going up 75, now we've got a number of what that actual pass-through traffic is, and we need to accommodate. And we're looking at something more like 40 or 50,000, rather than say, how do we build for Black Friday parking lot, right? Because that's the fundamental mistake we tend to make in all transportation planning, all parking planning, is what's the peak maximum? It's like, well, we don't actually want that, do we? On every day. So what are we really trying to accommodate? Because fundamentally, we also need to be thinking about what do we want downtown to be, right? We want downtown to be much more healthy, much more vibrant, generating much more tax base than it currently is. Frankly, uptown has higher tax base than downtown does. We want more housing there, so how do we deliver it? Well, that's part of the challenge. When I was working with Baylor before all this, they wanted housing for all levels, all income levels within their walls, from students and janitors up to docs and execs, but the economics didn't work because land values were too high, rents were too low. So it was an upside down real estate market, and that's part of when I had the aha moment to say, well, what if we flooded the market with land? Well, there's a lot of land under this gigantic highway. And so what Tool brought to the table, they say, well, there's a rule of thumb that you need about 2 surface street lanes, city street lanes, to accommodate or replace 1 highway lane. So if we've got 8 lanes coming through here, okay, how do we create 16 new lanes of capacity if we're trying to accommodate the exact same amount of cars today? Now, is that a goal? No, it shouldn't be, but let's just accommodate it because that should settle the argument, theoretically. And so they came up with 2 schemes, and these are concepts. And on the 2 far sides, 1 and 4, is what came out of the City Map plan. A highway that comes down all of a sudden becomes city streets. And then option 4 is, how do we drop all 8 lanes into a trench? And they said, well, we don't think either of those options are optimal. Instead, what if we slowly peeled off the lanes on I-2 in version 2 and utilized a much bigger grid than what we were talking about before, in terms of just one boulevard handling all of that, which would probably fail. And then in version 3, they said, well, instead of a big trench, since we know only less than half the traffic is actually cut through traffic, what if we just made a smaller trench of just 4 lanes and it's all pass through? There's no exits into downtown. You have to exit earlier on the city street. So it really becomes half surface, half trench, which is sort of a modified version, which to me makes a lot more sense because it's accommodating where people are actually trying to go. But the smaller trench is also cheaper to span for if we're talking about deck parks, which that's the solution to everything. Or if
we have nice deck parks, by the way. I mean, you go to them all the time.
They're
deck parks.
They're very expensive to build. As well as air rights for development, right? If we're talking about that, it's a lot cheaper to span to build over highways if it's not 160 feet wide, which won't happen. And so they started looking at those 2 options, and then we've settled on these two in the middle to say, what if we went with these 2 hybrid options of the city map and took them to the next level? And that's what we're currently working on. We don't have any actual plans now, but conceptually, this is kind of what it looks like. Say, okay, what if we actually extended Riverfront Boulevard, which pretty much stops effectively around Commerce, extended that all the way down to 45, and built that along with the levee extension that is planned to be built in the next few years. And so all of a sudden, that's a lot more capacity that we have connecting into the network that starts much further back in the grid. And we don't have to interrupt the Cedars neighborhood because we can utilize all the empty capacity in Cesar Chavez and Good Latimer. So we peel another one off there. And the trench version is basically this scenario. And then the complete removal option basically peels another lane off for Good Latimer, and another lane off for making a 3rd boulevard through the corridor, because we have so much space because this current highway is so wide. And in between, we make developable blocks and parcels and parks and everything that we need moving forward. So those are for conceptually how we deal with the traffic. And you say, okay, well, maybe it's not going 70 miles an hour like it does right now. Maybe, was it 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock? No, it's probably going 10 miles an hour. So, but that's the trade-off is, okay, city map said, versus a high-speed highway, these surface streets will move, it'll take 2 minutes more. Okay, 2 minutes more to move through that corridor. To me, that's a worthwhile potential trade-off for us to consider for the potential $4, $5, $6 billion in private investment, 100 to 150 million more in the city's tax rolls. That's 3% of their budget. Would you like that, Chad? Yes. And potentially 12,000 new housing units. And because the private sector could potentially price that appropriately, if the city said, hey, we want this to have X amount of mixed income workforce housing units here, they can actually price that into the land sale. So it's not an after the fact transaction or negotiation with the city, which is what ends up killing all the potential affordable housing deals. So if they actually price it ahead of time, there's some predictability to it, and the private sector can help deliver what our need is, which is workforce housing for the teachers, the police, the firefighters, to live closer to where they work and live closer to the center of the city and bring another level of vibrancy to the city of Dallas and downtown. Okay, that was my last slide.
Well, to distill that information into a quick summation and standing in a room with someone who says, where am I going to drive? It sounds like there is existing street capacity that can provide comparable transportation to what 345
if it's improved. And I've heard some people say, well, what if we just shut it down for fun for a weekend and see what happens? Which I say that's a terrible idea. Although it did happen the one time a tractor trailer almost fell off. But the problem is because the way it snakes through, it severs so many north-south parallel streets. And what you want is parallel networks. Parallel networks is where the capacity comes from. It's where the resilience and adaptability comes from, because we've been dealing with this on the two-way conversion of McKinney, because McKinney is the one-way north, right? If there's a wreck or the trolley is broken down and there's parking, it's 3 lanes that come to one and there's no other way north-south. That's what the value of grids. It allows people to adapt and navigate through the area, but long-term, it's about restoring downtown as a destination, which then repurposes the rest of South Dallas to say, oh, the value in the real estate is now in proximity, not in, oh, it's just cheap. It's like, actually, we want more valuable land, because then it's easier for the public sector to say, you need to deliver mixed income housing as part of your development entitlements.
And they're ancillary questions that then manifest from these particular scenarios. I mean, what happens with, all the trucks that drive through the core? Where do they go? Maybe they go to 20 to 35 or 20 to 635 to completely get around the core? What happens to people who have to go work that live in southern Dallas or sunny South Dallas proper and need to go work in the medical district, which is apparently, as I've heard, where every single person that is from southern Dallas or sunny South Dallas works. That's the thing that keeps coming up. My question is, one, from a TxDOT feasibility study standpoint, those are questions that need to be answered. Where are the jobs? What are the roads being used to get people to do? And additionally, from a city standpoint and an economic development standpoint, how could you bring jobs closer utilizing this land? So you hear about housing all the time, and we think workforce housing is absolutely essential. We hear all the time about the need for more housing in the city as we go through the reurbanization of our core. But that's also, like, if we think archaically, you can only have one thing. If we think new design, you can have many things. You can have mixed primary use. You can have retail downstairs where people work. They work good jobs, and maybe they live right above the jobs that they work. So that's why I keep coming back to this idea of gathering the type of input and really going through a thorough vetting of multiple scenarios with the community attached to the process, so we can start to really get to getting away from the straw man arguments that for whatever reason continue to be perpetuated and get to the heart of these scenarios.
Can I add on to that truck question very quickly, please? Yeah, so the TxDOT's data showing this 18% of the traffic on 45 in that location is truck traffic. And so 18%. Yeah, so as part of this scenario, we used 15% to say 15% truck traffic. If it's just interstate commerce, you need to be on 635, you need to be on Loop 9, because we don't actually want you polluting and causing more congestion, where we actually want people living and breathing. And so that's part of that overall reduction. The other part is, what if we focused on when I talked about goal, is our goal just moving traffic, or is our goal, a vibrant city? We should be focusing on how do we reduce vehicle miles traveled, how do we reduce modal split for single occupancy vehicles, and we included a 5% reduction. 5%, maybe that sounds large. Well, the city's climate action plan is suggesting we need to get to 50% by 2050. That sounds huge and ambitious, but if you take it back, it's actually 1% per year. That's doable. Cities around the world, around the country, actually do that all the time now. So if we're thinking that way, if we're saying, how do we reduce mode share of cars from 80% to 79% by 2021, to 78%, to 76%, over time, this becomes a totally different conversation. It's the conversation that we actually should be having, which is, what is that city in 2040? What is that city in 2050? And are we all stuck in traffic the entire time?
Well, this sort of larger vision of not only is this a transportation, but it's an urban problem, it's an environmental problem, it brings to the fore something flawed in the way we plan cities, and that is that most of these issues that we're talking about, whether it's Riverfront Boulevard, whether it's reducing traffic, the TxDOT isn't in the business of Riverfront Boulevard. They're in the business of maintaining their roads. There have to be other stakeholders at the table leading with TxDOT to realize this vision. When you're talking about bringing more jobs to the center, affordable housing, workforce housing, who needs to be engaged? Who is engaged? Who needs to be more engaged? And who are the players and who can play a role?
Well, I mean, I think the encouraging thing is, as Patrick has laid out the tool design process, that there actually have been multiple stakeholders at the table who have been helping think through, in the case that this thing moves forward, what it would look like. And so, I mean, who are some of the stakeholders?
Michael Morris at COG, DART is involved. 5 directors from the city of Dallas, including transportation, economic development, neighborhood revitalization. There's 5 of them.
Peer Shaka.
Yeah, peer planning is involved.
Downtown Dallas Incorporated, I know,
has DDI, Deep Ellum, DART. We're keeping everybody involved at this point in time because it's mostly technical. But then once we have a street and block structure for the 2 plans, then it becomes hey, let's take this out to the public and the neighborhoods to say, okay, what do you want to see fill in these blocks?
And the second piece to that is that when we say, let's take it to the neighborhoods, I know what we're going to do with the Coalition for New Dallas. We are literally going to take this to the neighborhoods, not a 1 or 2 day, charrette where people come in and say, yeah, we want to go to the neighborhoods. We want to go to Mill City. We want to go to Bonton. We want to go to the Cedars. We're going to go into the communities. Because it's time that the people of this city, the actual community, the actual neighborhoods, are able to provide their input into this process. But and I think the bigger picture here is simply to say, there's a catalytic moment, specifically when CityMap happened. And it laid a groundwork for a lot of conversations that we can be having. So while the TxDOT process is happening for the next 18 to 24 month period, these conversations have to happen. And it's encouraging too to see someone like a Chad West who's here in the conversation, because I do believe that there will have to be a collective will amongst the council to reiterate the stance that this current council I think would be taking in adopting what the previous council under previous leadership signed on to, and then figuring out how do we keep this conversation going. Don't let it die a death of apathy.
When you go into those neighborhoods, just like I'm sure you'll hear the transportation conversation, I think another question that'll be raised, because it's been raised throughout, is, so you're talking about taking down a road and creating billions in economic development. How is that going to help me, or why is this not another of Dallas's famous developer rushes? And Amber, how do you communicate that? How do you make that argument? How do you assure people that it isn't going to be inequitable development, that there is going to be a way to break with the track paths of the history and actually make this work for, if not everyone, as many people as possible?
That's ambitious, right? I do believe, though, that it starts with beginning to have these conversations like Miguel talked about, and then asking what folks need from the community. And I think this concept of community benefits agreements, has anyone heard of community benefit agreements? A few people, right? Everyone in the room needs to raise their hands, especially as it relates to development. Because what it is saying to folks is like, basically, we got y'all. These are the things that we will do to protect the people that are here. To ensure that we both benefit from this. And I also wonder how many people within the city of Dallas have heard of this. I also think that there are things right now that we can begin to do to show the community that they will benefit from things. And so really just starting to create small acts of faith that folks will then entrust on larger projects. I think right now, this is such a big thing to say to people, just flat out come out and trust us. No. Right, but I do think through small things that are going to happen, like it can definitely occur. And I think that if folks are seeing that DART is getting its act together, right? DART is coming in and saying, yes, we have a seat at the table. Like even what you shared, Patrick, that people know that. And that list of folks, I didn't hear like a representative from South Dallas, and I could have missed it. But ensuring that all of the entities are involved, and not taking for granted, right, that this is too cerebral or too planny for everyone to have a seat at the table. But we are actually going to create voice, and like we're not going along with this until we can really see that everyone that is affected, impacted, benefits in equitable ways.
If I can add to that, from a coalition standpoint, we haven't taken the stance that there is any fait accompli here. I mean, we are sincere in saying that we want whatever ultimately it happens, whether the thing stays or comes down, we want it to be driven by research and data. We want there to be sincere input and fidelity to the input process. And we also want to just help kind of get the straw mans out of the way. The question about who owns the land underneath TxDOT, one of the political arguments that has manifest has been this is some huge developmental play. Some developers are lurking in the shadows somewhere because they own this land and they cannot wait until they can pounce on this. Well, the answer to that question is, if I'm not mistaken, the state owns the land because it's a state highway. So the question we need to be having as a city is, if the thing comes down, what role can the city play well in advance of it coming down to begin to do the things that Amber just talked about, to begin to figure out how can we acquire this land. If we do acquire the land, how are we going to zone the land? What's the process we're going to put in place to ensure that the zoning makes the most sense from a developmental standpoint? Again, how do we involve the community in that process as well? Is it a community bargaining agreement, neighborhood by neighborhood? But that's going to be essential, is clarifying the boogeymen and the strong men, and then intentionally putting in place processes, intergovernmental processes that allow for this decision to be thoughtful.
Yeah, and just to add real quick, like when you look at what happened with I-30 and the land, like you will see in articles that the state did own the land and that the next best thing that happened was that the city would take the land. And so that has been proposed for I-30, like this is all in the newspapers very recently. And so I do think the storytelling element, which is what we are doing today, is very, very important. How does this news circulate? I do think other projects, like the project that's going on in Mill City with TxDOT, is another thing that, like, if we are saying, right, that we are here for the city of Dallas and the development of the city of Dallas, like that's a project that folks in this room could be behind and be thinking about. And what are the projects, like folks in South Dallas forever have been complaining about projects that haven't been done correctly in their neighborhoods. And so I think too, right, like if we show equal interest in what's going on in the north, the south, the east, and the west, it'll take us a lot further as well.
Well, I wanted to make sure we had time for questions from the audience, and if anyone does have questions, to raise their hand. And I think we have a mic that we're going to float about here. So we have a few. If you want to start, Rachel down here on the front row. Yes.
Hi. Yes.
Hello, Charles Mann. I have a question, but first I want to say that I think that the problem with what we're talking about is the first thing we have to do is we have to do a paradigm shift. We have to change people's minds about how we look at the future of traffic and just getting around in our community, okay? So my question is, how do we go about that? How do we change those minds? And specifically, my question is, how do we change TxDOT's mind, okay?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so the first thing is we absolutely do for a paradigm shift, but the good thing, to go to question number 2, how do you change TxDOT's mind? I'd make the argument that I think TxDOT had a mind change or mind shift back in 2014 when they began to initiate the process of the Dallas City Center map. So that's a good start, but we have to make sure that TxDOT doesn't forget that happened. And at the meeting that I went to, it almost seemed as if it was forgotten, because City Map was one slide and it said this thing happened, and here are 4 pictures of what it looks like. On to the next slide. So that's number 1. The other thing is, I'm really encouraged by what is underway at City Hall when it comes to strategic mobility, things like the Vision Zero plan, and even I just had a presentation about how the Climate Action Plan can direct what happens with the city transportation plan. So there are 3 plans right now: the Strategic Mobility Plan, the Vision Zero plan, and the Climate Action Plan, that over the course of the next few months, my hope is will manifest, so that way the city can begin to truly change the narrative around the paradigm of how you plan a city with traffic and multimodal transit, particularly, at the forefront of your planning process.
Anyone down here, Frank?
Hey, thank you all. My name is Fasani Burton, and I really appreciate this panel because you all really reflect my journey with the 345 question. I'm a long-time South Dallas proper resident and advocate. And to speak to each of you, the beginning of this journey, the first thing, I'm also a candidate for U.S. Congress in 2020 for the 30th district. Thank you. At the beginning of the 345 question, my first gut reaction was fear. And I was afraid because I did not trust the city and I did not trust the process. I was afraid for myself because, like, I'm down here in South Dallas and I'm cut off from everything that I need to live. And then I was afraid for my community because of the many, many, many years of struggle that has been introduced to the community because of the continued way we are kind of left out of the equation. After I got over that initial fear, I then started to connect more with neighbors and speak and talk, find out where were they working, how were they getting there, what's going on. Then I got a better view of where everyone was going, how they were getting there, what were the possibilities. And then my next step, I started to not use 345. I started to look for alternative ways to get around. And then once I did all of this, I started to envision possibilities and what could be done if I act with a foreknowledge and with a plan and with a vision that is inclusive and not with the gut reaction of what do I do to maintain the little that we have, but how can we grow, how can we build on the progress that we have? And so my question to this panel or to anyone is that, one, as a candidate for Congress, is there a role that a representative, the federal government, can play in this process in order to make sure that it is hastened appropriately and equitably and with consideration for those who do have the same type of fears that I have? Or is it better that they stay out of the equation and just leave it to the local folks and let them decide how it should be done and tell us what needs to be done, and then just be supportive of what comes from the community. So thank you all.
Well, yeah, it's a really great question. I mean, we have to have all government at the table, because where's this funding going to come from, and how are studies going to be conducted? So there's a host of things. I'll tell you, my congressman is Colin Allred, and he has asked me about what do the current scenarios suggest, how does traffic move around, and there are elements of his district that would be directly impacted. I actually live right down the street from 345 as well, so this is a road that I take or sometimes maneuver around. So I do think that the federal government has to have a seat at the table, because they are going to have to be our champions when we think about getting creative around advocating for the type of funding necessary. And in some ways, if they want to take an even bigger role, be an advocate for being willing to think about the possibilities the way that you are thinking about them now. I mean, I still think to this day, I hold out hope that we look to our elected and appointed officials to be people that help make sense of things. And if you have federal designation, you get looked to pretty often. So absolutely, I think it's a critical role to play, and they're going to have a seat at the table. Now, do they make the decision, or does the community make the decision? That's a fine balance. And I think right now it tends to be heavily weighted on one side.
I have this debate with the Congress of New Urbanism leadership every year. And so the Congress of New Urbanism puts, every 2 years, they put out this Freeways Without Futures report, of which 345 has been on the top 10 since 2017, so the last two. And I always say, hey, is this really needs to be a grassroots movement, or do we actually need this coming from the federal government down? Because these were federal programs that made it, and it was those federal dollars and that federal power that basically plowed through neighborhoods. But of course, Eisenhower didn't want them plowed through neighborhoods. It was the locals saying, yeah, do it at this neighborhood, this red line neighborhood right here. So like Miguel said, very fine line. I have always advocated we need advocates in DC for this, because it is so hard, because it's so different, because grassroots movements are so challenging. And I've always looked to where these have been done in the past. There have been powerful elected leaders who have got it done. In Seoul, South Korea, the guy ran for mayor on this topic, won, and had the dynamite out the next day. He became president of South Korea a couple of years later, right? On the flip side, Milwaukee, the mayor was like, hey, I'm 25 million to remove, 75 million to rebuild, no brainer, let's take it out, 25 million. But just like 345, it also had a 3 designation, which means it's a stub on the interstate system. Turns out you need the federal government to say, check a box to say it's no longer on the interstate system. Turns out it's actually really easy. But if you have an advocate in DC, it cannot hurt. I think is the only thing I could really add.
Other questions down here?
Hi, my name is Whitney Stevens. Yes, hi, how are you? How are you? I'm a merchant planner, designer. I have 2 questions that I think might actually dovetail into each other. The first one is kind of about the positive benefits of removal, specifically for South Dallas, because I see how it would benefit developers and people immediately in the downtown area. And also, along with that, like, what are the plans for potential gentrification should that happen or if it happens? And then the other one is more transit related. So outside of using like the street grid, like what are other options that people can have in terms of getting to where they need to be, and how do you plan for that, and what would that look like?
Yeah, I can jump on those last 2 right away. And from a transit perspective, on the dartboard, I know we need to drastically improve transit. We need to drastically improve frequency. We need to drastically improve our corridors coming through downtown. That's one of the problems with the limited access loop around it. There's only a few ways in and a few ways out of downtown, and that means there's a lot of competition for those few lanes. We have a more redundant, more robust grid. There's potential for more high-capacity bus lanes, and that's the new sort of thing in transit around the country right now is rapid ride bus lines, and that's one of my goals as we begin to redesign our bus network, which is going to be launched in 2022, which we've got Jarrett Walker, who's the best bus planner in the entire world, working on. So that's something to keep involved in. The gentrification is the critical issue from my standpoint. Obviously not at 345 because there's nothing underneath it or around it. But as it comes further south into South Dallas Cedars, that is an issue. And that's what's not been included in this document, which is one of those things which we want to include in our plan, which is if we're going to create so much value, so much tax base next to downtown, we want to have equitable development strategies. We want to have neighborhood stabilization strategies to create a fund out of that new tax revenue to be doing the appropriate thing in the appropriate neighborhood. And that becomes a little bit more fine-grained depending on the neighborhood. But east of 45, it's mostly single family. Are we setting up tax abatements for that area for 20 years or whatever it needs to be to say, okay, let's make sure the rising value doesn't impact the residents that are currently there. How do we create a home ownership program? Ian Lockwood, a tool, did this in West Palm Beach, Florida, which shifted all the single-family renters into single-family homeowners. So then people are empowered to make the decision when they want to make the decision to sell or not sell. So we have to be having all those strategies in place, and that's going to be part of our recommendations.
I think another thing is, again, this idea that everybody from Southern Dallas works in the north is one that both needs to be studied, and then once we've got those data, you can plan around that. Is there a way to be able to utilize this land to bring jobs that are attainable for the people who live close to that area, so that way they can have a closer commute to work, they can generate their income necessary, and not have to deal with the way that they perhaps, given what these arguments would suggest, get them far away from their home. Another thing to think about, though, is while there will be dispersal of traffic if the thing comes down across a whole host of arterial streets, there is something to be said about public safety. Jane Jacobs, when she wrote The Death and Life of American City, suggested the more eyes on the street, the better when it comes to public safety. When she talked about that, she talked about that in houses. But I'd make the argument, it could potentially be a benefit to certain communities dealing with crime right now, because people are having to go through those streets. You have more eyes on the streets, you have more people through the streets. And on top of that, think about the economic opportunity that comes to southern Dallas, and particularly sunny South Dallas, if people are using those streets more. What does that mean for the storefront shops? What does that mean for that community over there that was built in the Bonton area that right now has nobody using those storefronts or that housing? If you get more people in the community and you get more eyes on the streets, perhaps we see an uptick in public safety. Perhaps we see an uptick in local business and economic opportunity. There is reason to believe that could potentially be the case.
Other questions? Oh yeah, Chad, I think.
Thank you guys, and thanks for hosting this and providing sort of an alternative forum to what TxDOT's just doing, which is not really an info session. It's just kind of a meeting. Chad West, Dallas City Council, and I think you guys know I'm definitely in support of bringing it down in some fashion. And I appreciate that this group realizes the political aspects of it, that it's got to have some political willpower behind it, and it's hard to get that sometimes. And you guys know that, having dealt with City Council for a while. Several people in this room have asked me to request a briefing by the Transportation Committee at City Council on what the status of I-345 is, just to get people to put it on record. What is the status? And Mr. Kleinman's confirmed that will happen after the TxDOT meetings are over. Is there anything else the city can be doing at this point to sort of push the ball forward that I can actually get done with supportive colleagues without kind of scaring them and freaking them out? And then while you think about your answer to that, I'm, as chair of housing committee, I'm very excited to hear all of you guys talk about how important housing is as a piece of this, because if you can bring folks closer to where they work, bring them, into that area and actually build affordable workforce housing into this, it's a piece that can make it much more equitable. So I definitely want to look at using land use and zoning to make this a better package that the whole city can get behind. But so I'm going to be keeping that in mind for my committee. But in general, as a city council, what else could we be doing besides just requesting a briefing?
Yeah, I would start with the history, Chad. Thank you for that question. I mean, when you look at literally why freeways were created and where they were created and where they were placed, if you were in South Dallas and you were on Park Road, you could not find the other side of it until you crossed the freeway. And so when we, teaching the history, so when we literally talk about why freeways were created and where they were created, and even, when we talk about what we think it benefits us now, right? In communities of color is, we have the highest asthma rates, and that is caused by cars and pollution going directly through cities, right? And that is happening directly to students, to grade age students in this city, right? And then when you also begin to think about resources. Now, I will be honest, it will be a gentrification conversation if we don't have the right zoning and things in place, right? And so this is where CBAs come in, and it really does need to start with the city. It really does. The city of Dallas really needs to say what it has cost people. And that's the study of, eminent domain in this city, which has run rampant, which has taken land away from Black people, right? From Hispanic people in the city, and they have not been given it back, and that cost them something, and it cost a lot of people things economically. And so as much as we can begin to talk about how we redistribute resources, and who gets access, right? And if that was my community, and to be quite honest, it was, I want it back. I'll put that out there, right? And so what does it look like to give people back the things that were taken from them? And it's a hard question to ask, but it's one that we really need to be thinking about. It's if the city has literally stolen land from people, how do they get it back? And how do we go about doing that in a way that brings community together? Because here's the other thing, and I'll leave y'all with this. We can tear a freeway down. Tomorrow, we cannot rebuild the community and get people in the rooms together that need to be in rooms together, to get people to live in community together. And that is the work that we have to start doing right now, right? And so that's when I say, what is happening in South Dallas, North Dallas, East Dallas is equally as important right, is what happens in downtown. And once people feel, know, and believe that, those are the conversations, right? This freeway can go down tomorrow, and that's not even the problem. The problem is the divide that exists, right? The problem is that if you are a Black person living in South Dallas, your life expectancy is shorter than someone living in Highland Park, than someone living in far North Dallas, right? Your access to educate, like those are the things. And that's why I say take this freeway down tomorrow. But talk to me about housing. Talk to me about access to education. Talk to me about all of those things, because that is going to make Dallas, Texas, the city that I was born in, the city that I was raised in, the city that I will stay in.
I would say don't rush it, even though we all want this to happen as fast as possible. These things don't happen that fast, but we already are expediting it from 2040 to potentially 2027, fingers crossed. But I think if we start rushing, hey, let's all have big community meetings without adequate information to share, we end up running into the problem that TxDOT did last week, which there's nothing to share and lots of people wanting information. It just becomes chaos and hysteria and confusion. So I think stay engaged from the council level, as also the city managers and the directors, and we want to make sure everybody's still engaged and still part of the conversation. But we have to advance things to a certain point with that input from the city, of course, as well. But until we have that kind of information to start to the public to react to, they have to have that, or else we're not really having a conversation at all.
I'd say, Councilmember and Chairman, thank you so much for your willingness to be able to advance this conversation. I mean, the fact that you and your colleagues are willing to get briefed on this, just to kind of get a pulse check of where the new council stands, goes a hell of a long way to advancing the ball down the field and determining whatever the future is going to be. So thank you. Can you advance to slide 1, Patrick? One of the most immediate things that you can do, council member, and anyone in this room can do, now that I hope you have a little bit of a better understanding as to what is going on with CityMap, and you can go to dallascitymap.com, by the way, to understand a deep dive into each of these scenarios. But one of the things that you can do, and all of you can do, TxDOT has a public comment period that they have attached to these community input sessions that they just finalized. And it ends on December 20th, 2019, which is just a few days away. You can submit your thoughts. What do you want to see happen to 345? What do you think are things that TxDOT should take into consideration? I would encourage you, in fact, I would encourage every one of you almost immediately. If you want to use this room, we'll keep it open, or well, you guys will keep it open, I hope, for the next few minutes, and take the time to fill out put your thoughts in an email and send it. And well, he left, but if you could advance, there's one additional slide. Thank you. One additional slide, and that slide is 345study.com. There was a survey that was being conducted during these meetings. People could go to a computer and they could give their thoughts about how they use 345, what they do when 345 is not being used, how they get around it, the arterial highways, and where they work, and so on and so forth. You can take the time to go to this website. You can fill that out. So number one, I hope you'll do it, council member. Number two, I hope you'll help share this information through your social media and to your colleagues as well. The last thing I'll say is, this recent election, Coalition for New Dallas asked council candidates, where do you stand on 345? Do you think it should come down? Do you think it should stay up? And based on that answer, they issued their endorsements. It was new for the Coalition for New Dallas. A supermajority of the mayoral candidates said they'd like to see the thing come down. And if I'm not mistaken, 13 of the 15 of the full council said they actually would like to see the thing come down. Now, I'll say that's during a campaign. And so the question becomes, where does our city leadership stand today? So I would ask that we get a better understanding of that, but also for those that want to be engaged in this process, it's my hope that they'll have community meetings as well moving forward.
Well, thank you all. And if you have additional questions, I'm sure the panelists will be hanging out here in the front for a little bit. Thank you everyone for coming out. Thank you guys for all your thoughts.